The dust kicked up from Blackwood's hooves could be seen for miles across the Texas plains. She was a legend in 3 counties, a wild Mustang Mare so fierce that grown men crossed themselves when her name was spoken. Black as midnight with eyes like burning coals, she had sent more cowboys to the doctor than any Brock in the state. And now she stood in the center of Jeremiah Michael Lister's corral, snorting and pawing at the earth like she was daring the world to try her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. McAllister leaned against the fence post, his weathered hands gripping the rails as he watched 24 cowboys gather around his property. Word had spread fast about his challenge, and now half the county had shown up to witness what most folks were calling either the greatest opportunity or the biggest fool's errand in Texas history. "Break this wild Mare," McAllister had announced at the saloon 3 nights prior, "and you can court my daughter Evangeline." The morning sun painted the McAllister ranch in shades of gold and amber as cowboys from across the territory continued arriving in clouds of dust and jingling spurs. Some came alone, others in groups, but all had the same gleam in their eyes, a mixture of greed, ambition, and barely contained terror as they caught sight of Blackwood pacing behind the corral fence. Evangeline McAllister sat on the porch of the main house, her auburn hair catching the morning light as she watched the spectacle unfold. At 22, she was considered the most beautiful woman in 3 counties, with emerald eyes that could stop a man's heart and a spirit as independent as the Texas wind. She had turned down 17 marriage proposals in the past 2 years, much to her father's growing frustration. "This is madness, Papa," she had told him when he first announced his plan. "I won't be won like some prize at a county fair." Jeremiah McAllister was a man who had built his ranch from nothing but determination and sweat. He owned 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, 300 head of cattle, and enough money to buy half the town if he wanted. But he also had a daughter who refused every suitor who came calling, and at 58, he was growing anxious about securing her future. "That Mare has been nothing but trouble since the day we caught her," he had replied, stroking his graying beard. "She's injured 6 of my best men and costs me a fortune in feed. Any man who can break her has the patience and skill to handle anything life throws at him. That's the kind of man I want for you." Now, as the crowd gathered, Evangeline found herself curious despite her anger. She had watched Blackwood for months, and the Mare seemed almost supernatural in her defiance. The horse had been captured during a roundup the previous autumn, taken from a wild herd that roamed the untamed regions beyond the ranch boundaries. From the moment she arrived, Blackwood had made it clear that she belonged to no one. The first cowboy to try his luck was Bull Henderson, a massive man from the neighboring county who stood 6 feet 4 inches and weighed nearly 300 pounds. Bull had a reputation for breaking the most stubborn horses through sheer force and intimidation. He strutted into the corral wearing leather chaps and carrying a coiled rope, his chest puffed out like a bantam rooster. "This won't take but a few minutes," Bull announced to the crowd, tipping his hat toward Evangeline. "I've broken the Mustangs twice this size before breakfast." Blackwood watched him approach with those burning coal eyes, her ears pinned back and nostrils flaring. When Bull moved to throw his rope, the Mare exploded into motion. She reared up on her hind legs, striking out with hooves that could crush a man's skull, then spun and kicked with such force that the wooden fence post cracked. Bull stumbled backward, his confidence evaporating as Blackwood charged directly at him. The big man scrambled over the fence faster than anyone thought possible, landing in the dirt while the crowd erupted in nervous laughter. Blackwood stood in the center of the corral, snorting and tossing her mane as if she had just swatted away a troublesome fly. "Next," called out McAllister, though his voice carried less enthusiasm than before. The second attempt came from the Rodriguez brothers, Carlos and Miguel, who had traveled up from the border country. They were known for their teamwork in handling difficult livestock, and they entered the corral with lassos and a carefully planned strategy. Carlos would distract the Mare from the front while Miguel approached from behind with a blanket to throw over her head. Their coordination was impressive, but Blackwood seemed to anticipate their every move. As Carlos swung his rope, she ducked low and charged between his legs, sending him tumbling. Miguel tried to leap onto her back as she passed, but the Mare twisted like a serpent and sent him flying into the water trough with a tremendous splash. One by one, the Cowboys tried their luck. There was Lightning Jim Crawford, who prided himself on his speed and agility. Blackwood trampled his hat into the dirt and chased him 3 times around the corral before he managed to escape. Then came the Dalton twins, who attempted to overwhelm the Mare with numbers and ropes from multiple angles. Blackwood broke both their lassos and left them hanging from the fence rails like laundry on a line. By midday, 8 men had tried and failed. Some nursed bruised ribs, others tended to wounded pride, but all had gained a healthy respect for the Black Mare, who seemed more like a force of nature than a mere horse. The crowd began to murmur that perhaps the challenge was impossible, that McAllister had set a task that no mortal man could complete. It was then that a stranger rode up to the ranch. He came from the east, sitting easy in his saddle on a paint horse that looked travel-worn, but well cared for. The man himself appeared to be in his early 30s, tall and lean with sun-weathered skin and calm brown eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. He wore simple clothes, denim pants, a cotton shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. Nothing about him suggested wealth or status, and several of the watching cowboys snickered as he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. "You here to try your luck with Blackwood, stranger?" called out Bull Henderson, still nursing his bruised ego from the morning's humiliation. The man removed his hat and nodded politely. "If Mr. McAllister is still accepting challengers, yes." "Sir, I'd like to give it a try. What's your name, son?" McAllister asked, studying the newcomer with interest. "Thomas Whitman, sir. I've been traveling through, heard about your challenge in town." "Well, Thomas Whitman, I hope you've made peace with your maker, because that devil horse has sent better men than you to the doctor today." Thomas nodded again, his expression remaining calm and respectful. "I appreciate the warning, sir. Might I ask how long each man gets to try?" "No time limit," McAllister replied. "You can stay in there until you break her, she breaks you, or you give up, and no restrictions on methods." "None, so long as you don't harm the animal. She's valuable even if she can't be ridden." Thomas walked slowly to the corral fence and stood watching Blackwood for several long minutes. The Mare had worked herself into a lather from the morning's confrontations, and sweat darkened her coat until she gleamed like polished obsidian. She paced back and forth along the far fence, occasionally pawing the ground or tossing her head in defiance. "What do you think, stranger?" someone called out, still feeling confident. Thomas turned away from the fence without answering and walked back to his horse. The crowd began to murmur that he was having second thoughts, that he had taken one look at Blackwood and decided to save himself the embarrassment. But instead of mounting up and riding away, Thomas began removing items from his saddlebags. He pulled out a small cloth sack, a leather water pouch, and what appeared to be strips of dried meat. Then he sat down in the shade of a cottonwood tree and began to eat his lunch, seemingly oblivious to the stares and comments from the growing crowd. "What in the Sam Hill is he doing?" Bull Henderson demanded. "Maybe he's building up his strength," suggested one of the Rodriguez brothers. Evangeline found herself studying the stranger with growing interest. While every other man had approached the challenge like a battle to be won through force or cunning, this Thomas Whitman seemed to be treating it like a puzzle that required careful consideration. There was something in his unhurried manner that set him apart from the others, a quality she couldn't quite identify but found oddly compelling. After finishing his meal, Thomas stood and brushed the dust from his clothes. He walked to the corral gate, opened it slowly, and stepped inside. Unlike the previous challengers, he made no dramatic gestures or bold announcements. He simply closed the gate behind him and stood quietly near the entrance, his hands at his sides and his posture relaxed. Blackwood had been watching him through the fence rails, and now she turned to face this new intruder in her domain. Her ears flattened against her skull, and her eyes blazed with familiar fury. She had successfully repelled 8 attackers, and her confidence was riding high. This quiet man would be no different from the others, but Thomas didn't advance. He didn't reach for a rope or make any threatening movements. He simply stood there, as still as a fence post, and watched the Mare with those calm brown eyes. Minutes passed. Blackwood snorted and pawed the ground, trying to provoke a reaction. When Thomas remained motionless, she took a few steps toward him, then stopped, unsure how to respond to this unexpected behavior. Every other human who had entered her territory had immediately tried to assert dominance. This one seemed content to simply exist in the same space. The crowd grew restless. "Do something," someone shouted. "You can't break a horse by staring at it." But Thomas ignored the calls and comments. He had positioned himself where he could see both the Mare and the gate, but he made no move to approach her. Blackwood began to pace again, but now her movements seemed less aggressive and more confused. She would advance a few steps toward the strange man, then retreat when he failed to react as expected. As the afternoon wore on, something remarkable began to happen. Blackwood's pacing gradually slowed, and her aggressive posturing diminished. She still kept her distance from Thomas, but she no longer seemed to view him as an immediate threat. The fire in her eyes dimmed to a wary watchfulness, and her ears began to swivel forward occasionally, instead of remaining pinned back in constant anger. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'll be damned," whispered one of the watching cowboys. "Look at that." Thomas had been standing in the corral for nearly 2 hours, and in all that time, he had barely moved. His patience seemed infinite, his calm unshakable. While other men had tried to impose their will on the Mare through force or trickery, he appeared to be offering her something entirely different, the opportunity to make her own choices. Without pressure or coercion. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Blackwood made a decision that surprised everyone present. She stopped pacing and stood facing Thomas from across the corral. For several long moments, horse and man regarded each other in silence. Then, with cautious steps, Blackwood began to walk toward him. The crowd held its collective breath. Even Evangeline found herself leaning forward on the porch, her heart beating faster as she watched the scene unfold. Thomas remained perfectly still as the Mare approached, his breathing slow and steady, his hands relaxed at his sides. Blackwood stopped about 10 feet away from him and stretched her neck forward, nostrils flaring as she tested his scent. Thomas waited, neither advancing nor retreating, simply allowing her to investigate at her own pace. After what felt like an eternity, the Mare took another step closer, then another. When Blackwood finally stood close enough for Thomas to feel her warm breath on his face, the entire ranch fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath to witness this unprecedented moment. The Mare's dark eyes, which had blazed with fury all morning, now held something different, curiosity mixed with the wariness of a creature that had learned to trust nothing and no one. Thomas slowly raised his right hand, palm open, fingers relaxed. Blackwood's ears twitched forward, then back, as she studied this gesture. She had seen hands before, hands that held whips and ropes and harsh metal bits. But this hand simply waited, patient as morning frost, asking for nothing and demanding even less. The Mare extended her muzzle toward his palm, stopping just short of contact. Thomas could feel the heat radiating from her nostrils, could see the tiny scars on her face where previous encounters with humans had left their mark. A thin white line ran across her left cheek, and another marked her jaw, evidence of rough handling before she had come to the McAllister ranch. "Easy, girl," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible even to those standing closest to the fence. "Nobody's going to hurt you today." At the sound of his voice, Blackwood's ears flicked forward completely. The tone was unlike anything she had heard from the other men. No commands, no threats, just gentle reassurance floating on the evening air like a lullaby. She took one more step forward, and her velvet nose finally made contact with Thomas's palm. The touch lasted only a heartbeat before she jerked back, but Thomas smiled as if she had just handed him the moon. He lowered his hand slowly and took a small step backward, giving her space to process what had just happened. Blackwood stood her ground, no longer retreating to the far end of the corral, and Thomas knew they had crossed the first bridge. As darkness began to settle over the ranch, McAllister called out from the fence, "That's enough for today, son. Impressive work, but the sun's setting and my ranch hands need to get this corral secured for the night." Thomas nodded and turned toward the gate, but something unexpected happened. Blackwood followed him. Not close enough to touch, but she walked parallel to his path, maintaining that careful 10-foot distance they had established. When Thomas reached the gate, she stopped and watched him leave, her head held high and alert. "I'll be back tomorrow morning, if that's acceptable to you, Mr. McAllister," Thomas said as he secured the gate behind him. "You planning to stand there another whole day?" Bull Henderson scoffed. "That ain't breaking a horse. That's just making friends with it." Thomas turned to face the larger man, his expression remaining calm despite the mockery in Bull's voice. "Respect your pardon, sir, but it seems to me that friendship might be exactly what she needs." "Friendship don't put a saddle on a horse's back," Bull retorted, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement from several other cowboys. "Maybe not," Thomas replied, "but force and fear haven't worked out too well today either." The crowd began to disperse as lanterns were lit in the ranch house windows. Most of the cowboys headed toward town and the saloon, eager to wash the dust from their throats and nurse their wounded pride with whiskey and tall tailies. But a few lingered, fascinated by what they had witnessed and curious to see what tomorrow might bring. Thomas led his paint horse to the small grove of cottonwoods near the creek that bordered the McAllister property. McAllister had given him permission to camp there, and he had declined the offer of a bed in the bunkhouse, preferring the open air and the sound of running water to the snores and conversations of the ranch hands. As he unsaddled his horse and set up his simple camp, Thomas found himself thinking about the Mare and the long road that had brought him to this moment. He had been traveling for nearly 3 months, moving from ranch to ranch across Texas and the territories beyond, taking work where he could find it and learning from every horse and every horseman he encountered. Thomas Whitman had not always been a cowboy. He had grown up on a small farm in Missouri, the youngest son of a wheat farmer who had more debts than acres and more children than opportunities. When the drought of 1881 had destroyed their crops for the second year running, the family had been forced to sell the farm to pay their creditors. Thomas's older brothers had headed east to seek their fortunes in the growing industrial cities, but something in his heart had called him westward, toward the vast open spaces where a man could still make his own way in the world. His first job had been with a cattle outfit driving herds from Texas to the railheads in Kansas. The work was hard and dangerous, but Thomas had discovered that he possessed an unusual gift with horses. While other cowboys relied on breaking their mounts through force and dominance, Thomas found that patience and understanding often achieved better results with less risk to both horse and rider. Over the years, he had developed his own methods, techniques that old-timers called soft and young hotshots dismissed as weakness. But the horses responded to his approach, And gradually his reputation had spread among the ranchers and horse traders who valued results over swagger. Now, as he sat by his small campfire and watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Thomas reflected on what he had observed during his day with Blackwood. The Mare was certainly wild and strong-willed, but beneath her defiance he had sensed something else, a deep intelligence and a profound wariness born of harsh experience. She wasn't just fighting against capture. She was protecting herself from further pain and betrayal. Meanwhile, up at the main house, Evangeline McAllister sat in her bedroom window, gazing out toward the grove of trees where the stranger's campfire flickered like a fallen star. She had watched the entire day's events from the porch, and the memory of that quiet moment when Blackwood had touched Thomas's hand kept replaying in her mind. Her father had knocked on her door an hour earlier, clearly excited by the day's developments. "Did you see that, Evangeline? That young man has more sense in his little finger than all those other fools combined. He understands that some things can't be taken by force. They have to be earned." Evangeline had nodded politely, but inwardly she was grappling with conflicting emotions. Part of her was genuinely impressed by Thomas's patient approach and the breakthrough he had achieved with Blackwood. But another part of her resented being reduced to a prize in her father's elaborate contest. Regardless of the winner's character or methods, she thought about the 17 proposals she had rejected over the past 2 years. Some had come from wealthy ranchers' sons who saw her as a path to combining their family fortunes. Others had been from ambitious men who viewed marriage to her as a stepping stone to higher social standing. A few had seemed genuinely smitten, but their affection had been based on her appearance and her father's money, rather than any real understanding of who she was as a person. The irony was not lost on her that the one man who had shown genuine patience and respect, qualities she valued above all others, was competing not for her hand, but for the challenge itself. She had seen the way Thomas looked at Blackwood, with understanding and compassion rather than the desire to dominate. It made her wonder what it would be like to be seen and understood in the same way. Down by the creek, Thomas was having his own reflections about the day's events. He had come to the McAllister ranch primarily because he needed work and had heard about the challenge in town. The idea of courting the rancher's daughter had seemed secondary to the opportunity to test his skills against a horse that had defeated so many others. But seeing Evangeline on the porch throughout the day had stirred something unexpected in his chest. She was undeniably beautiful, but it was more than that. There was an intelligence in her green eyes and an independence in her bearing that suggested depths he would like to explore. He had caught her watching him with what seemed like genuine interest, rather than the calculating assessment he had seen in the eyes of other wealthy ranchers' daughters. Still, Thomas was practical enough to know the vast gulf that separated them. He was a drifter with little more than his horse, his gear, and the clothes on his back. She was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the territory. Even if he succeeded in breaking Blackwood, what kind of life could he offer someone who had grown up in comfort and privilege? The next morning dawned clear and cool, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers across the range. Thomas was up before sunrise, as was his habit, and he spent the early hours tending to his horse and preparing for another day with Blackwood. He had brought oats and carrots in his saddlebags, thinking they might prove useful in building trust with the Mare. By the time the sun cleared the eastern horizon, a crowd had already begun gathering at the corral. Word had spread through the county about the stranger's unusual approach, and people came from miles around to witness the continuation of what many were calling the most interesting horsebreaking attempt they had ever seen. Thomas noticed that the crowd was different today. Along with the cowboys and ranchers, there were townspeople, women, and even children. Someone had set up a small stand selling coffee and biscuits, turning the event into something resembling a county fair. Thomas felt a flutter of nervousness at performing before such an audience, But he pushed the feeling aside and focused on the task ahead. Blackwood was waiting for him in the corral, and Thomas was pleased to see that she didn't retreat to the far fence when he approached. Instead, she stood in the center of the enclosure, watching him with those intelligent dark eyes. Her posture was alert, but not aggressive, and Thomas took this as an encouraging sign. He entered the corral slowly, moving with the same deliberate calm he had shown the previous day. This time, however, he carried a small cloth bag in his left hand. Blackwood's ears pricked forward as she caught the scent of oats, and Thomas smiled at her obvious interest. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, softly, stopping about 15 feet away from her. "I brought you something." Thomas reached into the bag and pulled out a handful of oats, holding them in his open palm. Blackwood took a step forward, then stopped, clearly torn between hunger and caution. The oats smelled sweet and fresh, unlike the hay and grass that made up her usual diet. "No rush," Thomas murmured. "They'll be here whenever you're ready." He sat down cross-legged in the dirt, still holding out the oats, and settled in to wait. The crowd murmured impatiently at this development, expecting more dramatic action, but Thomas ignored their restlessness. He had learned that horses, like people, responded better to invitation than to demand. It took nearly an hour, but eventually Blackwood's curiosity and appetite overcame her wariness. She approached Thomas in a series of stops and starts, advancing a few steps and then pausing to reassess the situation. When she finally reached him, she stretched her neck down and delicately lipped the oats from his palm, her whiskers tickling his skin. "There's a good girl," Thomas whispered, reaching slowly into the bag for another handful. "I knew you had it in you." This time, Blackwood didn't retreat after eating. She remained standing beside Thomas, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her powerful body. Very slowly, moving with the deliberate care of a man defusing a bomb, Thomas raised his free hand toward her neck. Blackwood tensed as his fingers made contact with her coat, but she didn't bolt. Thomas began to stroke her neck with gentle rhythmic movements, speaking to her in low, soothing tones. The Mare's skin twitched under his touch at first, but gradually she began to relax, even leaning slightly into the contact. "Would you look?" At that, breathed one of the watching cowboys. "He's got her eating out of his hand." "More than that," replied another. "She's letting him touch her." "I wouldn't have believed it if I wasn't seeing it with my own eyes." Thomas spent the entire morning building on this foundation of trust. He introduced Blackwood to the feel of his hands on different parts of her body, her shoulder, her withers, her flank. Each new touch was met with initial resistance followed by gradual acceptance. By midday, he was able to run his hands along her sides and even lift her hooves to examine them. "She's got good feet," he announced to McAllister, who had been watching intently from the fence. "Strong and well-formed. Someone took care of her before she went wild. Probably belonged to one of the ranches that got burned out during the Apache troubles 2 years back," McAllister replied. "A lot of livestock went feral when their owners abandoned the territory." This information gave Thomas new insight into Blackwood's behavior. If she had once been domesticated and then traumatically separated from human care, it would explain both her intelligence and her deep mistrust. She wasn't just a wild horse learning about humans for the first time. She was a horse who had learned to associate humans with loss and abandonment. The afternoon brought a new challenge. Thomas knew that eventually he would need to introduce Blackwood to the idea of carrying weight on her back. But first, he needed to accustom her to the feeling of something resting across her spine. He started with his hat, laying it gently across her withers while continuing to stroke her neck and speak in soothing tones. Blackwood shifted nervously at the unfamiliar sensation, but didn't buck or bolt. After a few minutes, Thomas removed the hat and replaced it with his vest, then his saddle blanket. Each item was met with initial tension followed by gradual acceptance. Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out in Blackwood's body language. her desire to flee warring with her growing trust in this patient human, who asked for so little and offered so much. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of pushing for more progress, he removed the saddle blanket and simply stood beside Blackwood, stroking her neck and speaking quietly to her. "That's enough for today, girl," he murmured. "You've been braver than I had any right to expect. Tomorrow we'll try a little more, but only if you're willing." When he turned to leave the corral, Blackwood followed him to the gate, just as she had the night before. But this time, she whickered softly as he closed the latch, a sound that sent a thrill through Thomas's chest. It was the first vocal communication she had offered, and he chose to interpret it as a farewell between friends. The crowd dispersed more slowly than they had the previous evening, with many lingering to discuss what they had witnessed. There was a growing sense that they were watching something special unfold, something that transcended the simple breaking of a wild horse. Evangeline had watched the entire day from her usual spot on the porch, and as evening fell, she found herself walking down toward the corral where Blackwood stood near the gate, looking out toward the grove of trees where Thomas was making his camp. The Mare turned as Evangeline approached, and for a moment, woman and horse regarded each other across the fence rails. "He's different from the others, isn't he?" Evangeline said softly, reaching out to touch Blackwood's nose through the fence. To her surprise, the Mare didn't pull away. "He sees you for who you really are, not just what he wants you to become." As if in response, Blackwood pushed her muzzle against Evangeline's palm, and in that moment, both of them seemed to understand that the events unfolding at the McAllister Ranch were about much more than breaking a wild horse. The third day dawned, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon, their dark bellies pregnant with rain that the drought-stricken land desperately needed. Thomas woke to the sound of thunder rumbling in the distance and felt the electric tension in the air that made both horses and humans restless. His paint horse was dancing nervously at the end of his picket line, and Thomas knew that Blackwood would be feeling the same atmospheric pressure. When he reached the corral, he found the Mare pacing along the fence with more energy than she had shown since his arrival. Her black coat gleamed with nervous sweat, and her eyes held a wild edge that reminded everyone present that beneath her growing trust lay the untamed heart of a Mustang born to run free across endless plains. The crowd that had gathered was smaller today, partly due to the threatening weather and partly because many had grown tired of watching what some dismissed as a prolonged exercise in patience rather than genuine horsebreaking. Those who remained were the true believers, the ones who sensed that something significant was building toward its climax. Thomas entered the corral, carrying his saddle for the first time. The crowd stirred with anticipation, and even Blackwood's pacing stopped as she focused her attention on this new development. The saddle represented everything she had been fighting against: the weight of human control, the end of her freedom, the transformation from wild creature to domesticated servant. "Easy now," Thomas murmured, setting the saddle down near the center of the corral and backing away to give Blackwood space to investigate. "It's just leather and wood. Can't hurt you any more than you let it." The Mare approached the saddle cautiously, circling it several times before stretching her neck out to sniff the foreign object. Thomas remained perfectly still, allowing her to conduct her examination without interference. Blackwood pawed at the stirrup, making the leather creak, then jumped back when the sound startled her. For nearly an hour, Thomas simply stood and watched as Blackwood grew accustomed to the saddle's presence. He had learned that rushing this process would only create setbacks, and he was determined to move at her pace rather than his own. The gathering storm seemed to echo his internal state, a building pressure that would soon need to find release. When Blackwood finally seemed comfortable with the saddle's presence, Thomas picked up the blanket he had used the previous day and began his careful approach. The Mare stood her ground as he placed the blanket across her back, though her muscles tensed beneath the fabric. Thomas spent several minutes stroking her neck and speaking softly until she relaxed again. "That's my brave girl," he whispered. "You remember this feeling, don't you? It's not so bad once you get used to it." The next step was the saddle itself, and Thomas lifted it slowly, telegraphing his intentions with deliberate movements. Blackwood's ears flicked back and forth as she tracked the saddle's progress, and when Thomas finally settled it onto her back, she shuddered as if struck by lightning. But she didn't buck. She didn't bolt. She stood trembling with barely contained energy while Thomas secured the cinch with gentle, steady hands. The crowd held its collective breath as they realized they were witnessing the moment that separated true horsemen from mere cowboys. The instant when trust became partnership. Thomas didn't attempt to mount immediately. Instead, he walked Blackwood around the corral with the saddle on her back, letting her adjust to the weight and feel of the leather against her sides. Mare's steps were high and nervous at first, but gradually she began to settle into a more natural rhythm. It was then that the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy with the promise of the deluge to come. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by a long roll of thunder that made both horse and human look nervously at the sky. "Maybe we should call it a day," McAllister suggested from the fence. "Storm's coming in fast, and that Mare's already spooked enough." Thomas paused to consider this advice. The smart thing would be to unsaddle Blackwood and wait for calmer weather. But something in the Mare's demeanor told him that this was their moment, that if he didn't take the next step now, the opportunity might not come again. "I think she's ready," he called back. "Sometimes you have to ride the storm instead of running from it." Evangeline, who had taken shelter on the covered porch as the rain began, felt her heart leap into her throat as she realized what Thomas intended. She wanted to call out, to warn him about the danger of mounting an unfamiliar horse during a thunderstorm, but something held her back. Perhaps it was the confidence in his voice, or the way Blackwood seemed to be listening to him with those intelligent dark eyes. Thomas gathered the reins in his left hand and placed his right hand on the saddle horn. Blackwood's ears swiveled toward him, and he could feel the coiled tension in her body like a spring wound to its limit. One wrong move, one moment of lost trust, and she would explode into bucking fury that could leave him broken on the ground. "We're partners now," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the increasing patter of rain. "I'm not going to take your freedom away. I'm just asking you to share it with me." He placed his left foot in the stirrup and paused, giving Blackwood time to accept this new sensation. The Mare shifted her weight but didn't move away. Thomas applied gentle pressure, lifting himself slightly off the ground while still keeping most of his weight on his right foot. Blackwood's breathing quickened, but she held steady. The rain was falling harder now, turning the dust in the corral to mud and making the wooden fence rails slick and dark. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, followed immediately by a crash of thunder so loud that several spectators cried out in alarm. But Thomas and Blackwood seemed to exist in their own private world, connected by invisible threads of trust and understanding. Thomas swung his right leg over the saddle and settled gently into the seat. For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then Blackwood took a tentative step forward, then another, carrying a human on her back for the first time in her life. The transformation was miraculous. The wild, defiant Mare, who had terrorized 8 cowboys just 3 days earlier, was now moving with graceful, controlled steps around the corral. Her ears were forward, her neck arched with pride rather than aggression, and there was something almost regal in the way she carried herself. Thomas guided her through simple turns and stops, using gentle pressure from his legs and subtle movements of the reins. Blackwood responded as if she had been reading his mind, anticipating his requests and flowing seamlessly from one movement to the next. It was clear that beneath her wild exterior lay the soul of a horse born to be ridden by someone who understood her true nature. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, their voices barely audible over the increasing intensity of the storm. But the celebration was premature. Just as Thomas was beginning to think they had achieved their breakthrough, a massive bolt of lightning struck a tree less than 100 yards from the corral. The explosion of light and sound was so intense that everyone present was momentarily blinded and deafened. Blackwood's reaction was instantaneous and primal. Every instinct screamed at her to flee from the supernatural terror that had just assaulted her senses. She launched herself into the air with a power that took Thomas completely by surprise, her back arching as she tried to shed the weight that was preventing her escape. Thomas had ridden bucking horses before, but nothing had prepared him for the explosive fury of a terrified Mustang in full flight. Blackwood twisted and spun with supernatural agility, her hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground as she fought to dislodge her rider. Thomas gripped the saddle horn with one hand and the reins with the other, trying to stay centered as the world spun around him in a chaos of rain, mud, and flying mane. The ride lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Thomas could hear the crowd shouting, could see flashes of movement through the rain and his own flying hair, but his entire focus was concentrated on staying with the horse beneath him. He knew that if he fell now, all the progress they had made would be lost. Worse, Blackwood might never trust another human again. But gradually, miraculously, the Mare's bucking began to subside. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the steady pressure of Thomas's legs against her sides, and the calm tone of his voice cutting through the storm. Whatever the reason, Blackwood's wild leaps transformed into more controlled movements, then into simple crow hops, and finally into a nervous but manageable trot. Thomas brought her to a stop near the center of the corral, and sat quietly in the saddle while both he and the Mare caught their breath. Rain was pouring down in sheets now, soaking them both to the skin and turning the ground into a muddy quagmire. But neither horse nor rider seemed to notice the discomfort. They had weathered their first storm together and emerged with their partnership intact. "I'll be damned," McAllister shouted over the noise of the rain. "He did it. He actually did it." But Thomas wasn't finished. He knew that simply surviving Blackwood's initial resistance wasn't enough. To truly break a horse meant establishing a relationship based on mutual respect and communication. He guided the Mare through a series of more complex maneuvers, backing up, sidestepping, changing leads at the trot. Each command was given with subtle cues rather than force, and Blackwood responded with increasing confidence and grace. By the time the storm began to move on toward the east, horse and rider were moving together with a harmony that drew gasps of admiration from the watching crowd. Thomas dismounted and immediately began checking Blackwood for injuries, running his hands along her legs and examining her hooves for stones or bruises. The Mare stood quietly for this inspection, occasionally nuzzling his shoulder with obvious affection. "Ladies and gentlemen," McAllister announced, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I believe we have ourselves a winner." The crowd surged forward, eager to congratulate Thomas and get a closer look at the now docile Mare. But Thomas held up his hand, asking for space. "She's had enough excitement for one day," he said firmly. "Best to let her rest and process what just happened." He unsaddled Blackwood carefully, rubbing her down with the blanket to remove as much moisture as possible. The Mare seemed reluctant to see him leave, following him to the gate just as she had on the previous days. But now there was something different in her behavior, an acceptance, even contentment, that spoke of a fundamental shift in her understanding of humans and her place in their world. As Thomas secured the gate behind him, he found himself face to face with Evangeline McAllister. She had come down from the porch despite the rain, and her auburn hair was damp with mist, her green eyes bright with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. "That was incredible," she said, having to raise her voice slightly over the sound of the departing storm. "I've never seen anything like it." Thomas removed his hat and attempted to squeeze some of the water from its brim. Your father has a remarkable horse there." She just needed someone to listen to what she was trying to say. And what was she saying? Thomas considered the question seriously. That she'd been hurt before. That she was afraid of being abandoned again. That she needed to know she could trust someone before she could give them her heart. Evangeline felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks at his words, recognizing in them a description that could apply as easily to herself as to Blackwood. And now she knows she's not alone. That someone understands her worth and won't try to change who she is at her core. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both pretending not to notice the meaningful looks passing between the other spectators. The challenge had been met and won, which meant that according to her father's proclamation, Thomas Whitman had earned the right to court her. But the reality of what that meant was only beginning to sink in for both of them. McAllister approached them with obvious satisfaction written across his weathered features. "Son, that was the finest piece of horsemanship I've seen in 40 years of ranching. You've more than earned the right to court my daughter, assuming she's willing." Thomas looked at Evangeline, searching her face for any sign of her feelings about this turn of events. "Miss McAllister, I hope you know that I didn't come here with any intention of. That is, I want you to know that my interest was purely in the horse, at least initially." Evangeline found herself smiling despite the awkwardness of the situation. There was something endearing about his obvious discomfort with the formality of the arrangement. Initially? Thomas felt his cheeks redden beneath his tan. "Well, I'd be lying if I said that meeting you hadn't become significant to me over these past few days." "How significant?" "Significant enough that I'd like very much to get to know you better, if you're amenable to the idea." Evangeline studied his face, noting the honesty in his brown eyes and the way he seemed genuinely concerned about her feelings, rather than simply claiming his prize. "I think I'd like that too, Mr. Whitman, though I should warn you that I can be every bit as stubborn as Blackwood when I set my mind to something." Thomas grinned, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, he looked completely relaxed. "Miss McAllister, after the past 3 days, I wouldn't have it any other way." As the crowd began to disperse and the last of the storm clouds moved on toward the horizon, Thomas found himself looking forward to tomorrow with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. He had come to the McAllister ranch seeking work and a chance to test his skills. Instead, he had found something far more valuable, the possibility of a future worth building and someone who might be willing to build it with him. The sun broke through the clouds just as evening fell, painting the wet landscape in shades of gold and crimson. In her corral, Blackwood stood with her head held high, no longer the wild, frightened creature who had terrorized cowboys just days before. Like Thomas and Evangeline, she had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories came not from conquest, but from the courage to trust and be trusted in return. 3 weeks had passed since the storm that changed everything at the McAllister Ranch. The news of Thomas Whitman's successful breaking of Blackwood had spread across the territory like wildfire, bringing visitors from as far as San Antonio to witness the Mare that now responded to her rider's lightest touch. But the greater transformation had occurred between Thomas and Evangeline, whose courtship had blossomed into something neither had expected when this strange contest began. Thomas had accepted McAllister's offer to stay on as head horse trainer, a position that came with a comfortable salary and a small cabin on the eastern edge of the property. Every morning, he would work with Blackwood and the other horses in McAllister's growing remuda, and every evening, he would walk up to the main house to share dinner with Evangeline and her father. The conversations during these meals had revealed depths in both Thomas and Evangeline that surprised them. She had studied literature and philosophy during 2 years at a finishing school in Dallas, and her sharp mind delighted in discussing everything from Shakespeare to the changing political landscape of the West. Thomas, despite his humble origins, proved to be well-read and thoughtful, with insights shaped by his travels and his deep connection to the natural world. "You're not what I expected when I first saw you ride up to our gate," Evangeline admitted one evening as they walked along the creek that bordered the property. The cottonwoods were turning gold with the arrival of autumn, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. "What did you expect?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. "Another fortune hunter, I suppose. Someone who saw the challenge as a means to an end rather than something worthwhile in itself." Thomas picked up a smooth stone and sent it skipping across the water's surface. "And what do you think now?" Evangeline considered her words carefully. Over the past weeks, she had come to understand that Thomas was unlike any man she had ever known. He possessed a quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself through bluster or aggression. More importantly, he seemed to value her thoughts and opinions as much as her appearance, encouraging her to speak her mind even when they disagreed. "I think you're the first man I've met who doesn't want to change me into someone else," she said finally. "You remind me of how you approached Blackwood. You saw what was already there and helped it flourish, rather than trying to impose your will." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her, his brown eyes serious in the fading light. "Evangeline, there's something I need to tell you. Something about why I really came here." A flutter of anxiety passed through her chest. "What do you mean?" "I wasn't completely honest when I said I'd heard about the challenge in town. The truth is, I'd been hearing stories about you for months, about the rancher's daughter who had turned down every suitor in 3 counties. Some of the talk wasn't very flattering." Evangeline felt her cheeks redden with embarrassment and anger. "What kind of talk?" "The usual things men say when they can't understand why a woman might have standards. That you were too proud, too particular, that you thought yourself above your station." Thomas's voice carried a note of disgust. "But there were other stories too, about your kindness to the ranch hands' families, about the school you helped establish in town, about your work with the church to help families displaced by Indian raids." "You came here to judge for yourself." Thomas shook his head. "I came here because I couldn't stop thinking about a woman who refused to settle for less than she deserved. The challenge with Blackwood was just an excuse to meet you." Evangeline stared at him in stunned silence. Part of her was angry at the deception, but a larger part was touched by the honesty of his confession. "And what conclusion did you reach?" "That every man who let you slip through his fingers was a fool. That you're worth 100 of the women who would have accepted any proposal that came with a good name and a bank account." The sincerity in his voice made her heart race, but years of disappointing suitors had taught her to be cautious. "Pretty words, Thomas. But words are easy to say. Then let me show you instead." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth by handling. "This belonged to my mother. It's not much compared to what other men could offer you, but it's honest." Inside the box lay a simple gold band set with a small but perfectly clear diamond. It was modest by the standards of wealthy ranchers' daughters, but it was beautiful in its simplicity and obvious care. "Thomas," Evangeline whispered, her voice catching in her throat, "I know I don't have much to offer compared to the sons of cattle barons and railroad men. I can't promise you a mansion or trips to Paris or a life of leisure. But I can promise you a partnership built on respect and trust. I can promise you honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. And I can promise you that I'll spend every day trying to deserve the gift of your love." Evangeline looked down at the ring, then up into Thomas's earnest face. 3 months ago, she would have been appalled at the idea of marrying a drifting cowboy with no family name or fortune. But 3 months ago, she hadn't known what it felt like to be truly seen and valued for who she was, rather than what she represented. "Ask me properly," she said softly. Thomas dropped to one knee on the bank of the creek, heedless of the mud that would stain his pants. "Evangeline McAllister, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, then laughed at the surprise that flashed across his face. Did you think I'd say no after all that? Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then stood and pulled her into his arms. Their first kiss was sweet and tentative, full of promise and the wonder of two people who had found something precious when they weren't looking for it. When they broke apart, Evangeline rested her forehead against his chest and listened to the rapid beating of his heart. Papa's going to have opinions about this. I've already spoken to him, Thomas admitted. This morning, actually. He gave his blessing, though he did warn me that I'd better be prepared to work harder than I ever have in my life. And are you? Prepared, I mean. Thomas tilted her chin up so he could look into her green eyes. For you? I'd work until my hands bled and my back broke. They walked back to the main house hand in hand, both glowing with the quiet happiness of people who had found their match. McAllister was waiting on the porch, a knowing smile on his weathered face and a bottle of his finest whiskey in his hands. I take it she said yes, he called out as they approached. She did, sir, Thomas replied, unable to keep the grin off his face. Good. About time this ranch had some happiness in it again. McAllister's expression grew more serious as he looked at his daughter. You're sure about this, Evangeline? Marriage is a long road, and there's no going back once you start down it. Evangeline squeezed Thomas's hand and smiled. I'm sure, Papa. More sure than I've ever been about anything. The wedding was planned for the first Saturday in November, which gave them 6 weeks to prepare. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the county, generating reactions that ranged from genuine happiness to barely concealed disapproval. Some of the wealthier families whose sons had been rejected by Evangeline made snide comments about her settling for a common cowboy, while others praised her for choosing character over money. Thomas found himself the object of intense scrutiny from the local community. Some men resented his success in winning a prize they had considered beyond his reach, while others respected the skill and patience he had shown with Blackwood. The women were generally more accepting, perhaps recognizing in Evangeline's choice a validation of their own hopes for marriages. Based on affection rather than convenience, the preparations for the wedding provided a welcome distraction from the gossip and speculation. Evangeline threw herself into the planning with enthusiasm, aided by the wives of several ranch hands who had become friends over the years. She had decided on a simple ceremony in the small church in town, followed by a celebration at the ranch. For anyone who cared to attend. Thomas, meanwhile, focused on his work with the horses and his preparations for married life. He expanded the small cabin that would serve as their first home, adding a second room and a proper kitchen. The work was hard but satisfying, and he found himself looking forward to the day when he could carry Evangeline across the threshold of a home they would share. One afternoon in late October, as Thomas was working with a young stallion in the training corral, he became aware of a commotion near the main house. Riders were approaching at speed, and from their urgency, it was clear they brought important news. The men turned out to be a circuit judge and his escort, traveling through the territory on official business. They had stopped at the McAllister ranch seeking fresh horses and a night's lodging, but their news proved far more significant than their immediate needs. There's been trouble up in Comanche County, the judge explained over dinner that evening. A band of rustlers has been hitting ranches along the Red River, making off with entire herds and leaving families destitute. The territorial governor is organizing posses to track them down, and he's calling for experienced men to volunteer. Thomas felt a chill of foreboding as he listened to the judge's account. The description of the rustlers' methods and their apparent knowledge of local terrain suggested they weren't ordinary thieves, but organized criminals with inside information about their targets. How many men are they looking for? McAllister asked. As many as they can get. The rustlers are well armed and dangerous, and they seem to know the country better than most of the local lawmen. They're particularly interested in men with tracking skills and experience handling difficult horses. Thomas caught Evangeline's eye across the table and saw his own thoughts reflected in her expression. His reputation with horses and his years of travel across the territory made him exactly the kind of man the governor would want for such a mission. After the judge and his escort had retired for the night, Thomas found himself alone with Evangeline and her father in the ranch house parlor. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken concerns. "You're thinking about volunteering," Evangeline said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded slowly. "Those families up north, they're in the same position your father was in when he started this ranch. They've worked their whole lives to build something, and now it's being stolen from them. If I have skills that could help." "The wedding is 3 weeks away," Evangeline pointed out, though her tone was more resigned than argumentative. "I know. And if this was anything else, I wouldn't even consider leaving. But people are suffering, and the territorial government doesn't have many men with the right experience." McAllister spoke up from his chair by the fire. "How long would you be gone?" The judge said probably 6 to 8 weeks, assuming they can track down the gang quickly. "Could be longer if the trail goes cold." Evangeline rose from her seat and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders and knew she was wrestling with conflicting emotions. Finally she turned back to face him. "If you don't go, you'll always wonder if you could have made a difference," she said quietly. "And if those families lose everything because good men were too comfortable to help, I couldn't live with knowing we might have prevented it." Thomas felt a surge of love and admiration for the woman he was about to marry. "You're certain?" "I'm certain that I fell in love with a man who does what's right, even when it's difficult. I can't ask you to stop being that man just because it's inconvenient for our wedding plans." "The ceremony can wait," McAllister added. "Justice can't always afford to." Thomas crossed the room and took Evangeline in his arms. "I'll come back to you," he promised. "Nothing in this world could keep me from that." "I know you will," she replied, though he could hear the fear beneath her confident words. "Just be careful. And come home to me as soon as you can." The next morning, Thomas saddled his paint horse and prepared to ride north with the judge's party. Evangeline stood beside Blackwood in the training corral, one hand resting on the Mare's neck as she watched her fiancé make his final preparations. "Take care of her for me," Thomas said as he approached the fence. "And remember everything I taught you about reading her moods." "She'll be fine," Evangeline assured him. "We understand each other now." Thomas leaned across the fence to kiss her goodbye, a gesture that was both tender and desperate. When they broke apart, he could see tears threatening to spill from her green eyes, though she fought valiantly to hold them back. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too. Now go, before I lose my courage and ask you to stay." Thomas mounted his horse and rode away from the ranch without looking back, knowing that if he saw Evangeline watching him leave, his resolve might crumble. Behind him, the woman he loved stood beside the horse he had gentled, both of them watching until he disappeared over the horizon. The autumn wind carried the sound of hoofbeats long after he had vanished from sight, and Evangeline found herself wondering how many weeks would pass before she heard that sound announce his return. In the corral beside her, Blackwood whickered softly, as if she too understood that something precious had been temporarily lost and might not easily be found again. The first snows of winter were beginning to dust the peaks of the distant mountains when Thomas finally returned to Callester Ranch. 2 months had passed since his departure with the territorial posse. 2 months during which Evangeline had received only 3 brief letters telling her that he was alive and the hunt continued. The rustlers had proven more elusive than anyone anticipated, leading the posse on a chase that stretched from the Red River to the New Mexico border before finally being cornered in a box canyon near Las Cruces. Thomas rode up the familiar trail to the ranch house just as the sun was setting on a cold December evening, his paint horse moving with the weary gait of an animal that had covered too many hard miles. Both horse and rider bore the marks of their ordeal, Thomas was leaner than when he left, his face weathered by constant exposure to wind and sun, while his mount showed the effects of weeks spent navigating rocky terrain and sleeping under the stars. Evangeline saw him first from the kitchen window where she was helping prepare dinner. The sight of that familiar silhouette against the crimson sky made her heart leap, and she dropped the dish she was holding, sending it crashing to the floor in her haste to reach the door. "Thomas!" she cried, running across the yard without thought for the cold air or the fact that she wore only a simple dress and apron. He was already dismounting when she reached him, and she threw herself into his arms with such force that he staggered backward. "Easy there," he laughed, though his voice was rough with emotion as he held her tight. "I promised I'd come back to you, didn't I?" Evangeline pulled back to look at his face, noting the new lines around his eyes and the thin scar that ran along his left cheekbone. "You're hurt," she said, her fingers tracing the mark with gentle concern. "Just a souvenir from a disagreement with a tree branch, nothing that won't heal." Thomas caught her hand and brought it to his lips. "I'm more concerned about you. Your letters said you were fine, but you look like you've lost weight." "I had trouble sleeping," she admitted, "and eating. Worrying about you, wondering if you were safe." She studied his face in the gathering dusk. "It was successful then? The mission?" Thomas's expression grew somber. "Eventually. We caught up with them 3 weeks ago. Most of the stolen cattle were recovered, though not all. Some of the rustlers surrendered when they realized they were trapped, but their leader—" He shook his head. "Let's just say he won't be stealing anyone's livelihood again." McAllister emerged from the main house, alerted by the commotion in the yard. "Thomas, about time you showed your face around here. We were starting to think you decided to become a permanent lawman." "No, sir," Thomas replied, shaking the older man's hand firmly. "I've had enough excitement to last me a lifetime. All I want now is to settle down with your daughter and raise horses." "Speaking of which," McAllister said with a meaningful look, "there's been some interesting developments while you were gone. Why don't you tend to your horse and clean yourself up, then join us for dinner? Evangeline can fill you in on everything that's happened." Thomas spent the next hour seeing to his paint horse's needs and washing away 2 months' worth of trail dust. When he finally sat down at the familiar dinner table, he felt as though he was returning to a life that had existed only in his dreams during the long nights on the trail. "Tell me about these developments your father mentioned," he said as Evangeline served him a plate piled high with beef, potatoes, and vegetables from the ranch garden. Evangeline exchanged a glance with her father before answering. "Well, for one thing, Blackwood is going to be a mother come spring." Thomas nearly choked on his coffee. "What? How is that possible?" "Apparently your gentle treatment of her awakened some natural instincts," McAllister explained with amusement. "She took quite a shine to Thunder, that big roan stallion I bought from the Henderson spread. Happened about a month after you left." "That's wonderful news," Thomas said, genuinely delighted. "Her foal should be something special, with bloodlines like that." "There's more," Evangeline continued. "Word of your success with Blackwood has spread further than we expected. We've had inquiries from ranchers as far away as Colorado and California, asking if you'd be willing to work with their problem horses. Papa thinks there could be good money in it." Thomas set down his fork and looked between Evangeline and her. "Father, you've been thinking about this seriously." "We've had 2 months to think about it," McAllister replied. "The truth is, Thomas, what you did with Blackwood was more than just breaking a difficult horse. You showed that there's a better way to work with these animals, a way that produces better results with less risk. There are a lot of ranchers who would pay well for that knowledge. The question is," Evangeline added, "whether you're interested in building that kind of business. It would mean travel, at least initially, though we could establish a training facility here at the ranch eventually." Thomas considered this unexpected turn of events. When he had left to join the posse, his only goal had been to help capture the rustlers and return to marry Evangeline. He hadn't given much thought to what would come after, beyond his position as head horse trainer for the McAllister Ranch. "What do you think, Evangeline?" "It would mean being apart sometimes, at least until we get established." "I think," she said, carefully, "that we've already proven we can survive being separated when necessary. And I think you have a gift that could help a lot of people, both horses and the humans who work with them. Besides," McAllister added with a grin, "it would be a waste to keep talents like yours confined to one ranch, even one as fine as mine." Over the following days, as Thomas readjusted to life at the ranch, more details of the proposed business venture emerged. During his absence, McAllister had been contacted by a wealthy cattle baron from Colorado, whose prize stallion had become virtually unmanageable after a traumatic encounter with wolves. The man was offering a substantial sum for someone who could restore the horse's usefulness without breaking his spirit. It would be a perfect test case, McAllister explained as they stood watching Blackwood graze in the winter pasture, her sides already beginning to show the subtle changes that indicated her condition. "If you can succeed with his horse, word will spread throughout the territory." Thomas watched the black Mare with satisfaction. Even in her pregnant state, she moved with the grace and alertness that had first captivated him. The wildness was still there, but tempered now with contentment and trust. She exemplified everything he hoped to achieve in his work with horses, animals that retained their natural spirit while accepting partnership with humans. "When would I need to leave?" he asked. "Not until after the wedding," Evangeline said, firmly joining them at the fence. "I've waited this long to marry you, and I won't wait any longer." Thomas turned to her with surprise. "I thought we'd have to postpone again, with everything that's happened." "On the contrary, I've spent the last 2 months realizing how uncertain life can be. I don't want to waste any more time on elaborate preparations." Evangeline's green eyes held a determination that reminded Thomas of Blackwood in her more stubborn moments. "I've spoken to Reverend Matthews, and he's agreed to perform the ceremony this Saturday, if you're willing." "This Saturday? That's only 4 days away. Too soon?" she asked, though her tone suggested she wouldn't accept that answer. Thomas pulled her into his arms, heedless of her father's amused observation. "Not soon enough," he said, and kissed her thoroughly. The wedding took place on a crisp December morning with snow falling gently outside the small church in town. Despite the short notice, the building was packed with friends and neighbors who had come to witness the union of the patient, Cowboy, and the rancher's daughter, whose courtship had become the stuff of local legend. Evangeline wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved for 25 years and altered to fit her slender frame. The ivory silk and delicate lace seemed to glow in the soft light filtering through the church's stained glass windows. Thomas, resplendent in a new black suit that McAllister had insisted on purchasing, could barely take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. When Reverend Matthews asked if there were any objections to the union, a few disapproving murmurs arose from some of the wealthier families, but they were quickly drowned out by supportive voices from the majority of the congregation. Thomas's hands shook slightly as he slipped his mother's ring onto Evangeline's finger, but his voice was steady as he repeated his vows. When Evangeline spoke her promises in return, her words carried the weight of absolute conviction, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife. The celebration at the ranch lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the county. Thomas found himself overwhelmed by the generosity and acceptance shown by the community that had once viewed him as an outsider. Even some of his former critics seemed genuinely pleased by the obvious happiness of the newlyweds. As the night wound down and the last guests departed, Thomas and Evangeline finally found themselves alone in the cabin that was now their home. Someone had decorated it with wildflowers and ribbons, and a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. "No regrets?" Thomas asked as they stood together in the doorway of their bedroom. "Only that we waited so long," Evangeline replied, reaching up to loosen his tie. "I love you, Thomas Whitman." "And I love you, Mrs. Whitman," he said, marveling at how naturally the new name seemed to fit her. Their wedding night was everything Thomas had dreamed it would be during the long, lonely nights on the trail. Evangeline came to him with a mixture of innocence and boldness that took his breath away, and they discovered together the joy of two hearts and bodies perfectly matched. The next morning brought the reality of their new life together. Over breakfast, they discussed the practical matters that married couples must face: how to manage their finances, where Thomas would set up his training operation, when he would need to travel for work. The offer from Colorado was still open. Thomas said as he sipped his coffee, "But I want to make sure you're comfortable with the idea before I accept." Evangeline considered this thoughtfully. "How long would you be gone?" "Probably 6 weeks, maybe 2 months if the horse proves particularly difficult." "And after that?" "If it goes well, there will likely be other offers. We could be looking at several trips a year, at least for the first few years." Evangeline rose from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the winter landscape where Blackwood was visible in the distance, moving carefully across the snowy ground. "I want to come with you," she said suddenly. Thomas nearly dropped his cup. "What?" "I want to come with you at least sometimes. I've spent my whole life on this ranch, and while I love it here, I'd like to see something of the world beyond these boundaries. Evangeline, the traveling would be hard. We'd be staying in hotels and boarding houses, dealing with all sorts of people." "Thomas," she interrupted, turning to face him with that familiar determined expression, "I married a man who treats horses with patience and respect because that's who you are. I didn't marry you so I could change you or cage you. Here like a pet canary. If your work takes you to Colorado or California or anywhere else, then I want to be part of that journey." Thomas stood and crossed to where she waited by the window. "Are you sure? It won't be easy." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," she replied, echoing words he had spoken to Blackwood months earlier. "But we'll face it together, just like we faced everything else." Thomas pulled her into his arms and spun her on the small kitchen, both of them laughing with the pure joy of two people who had found their perfect match. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside their little cabin, everything was warm and bright with promise. That afternoon, Thomas wrote his acceptance letter to the Colorado rancher, informing him that he and his wife would arrive within the month to begin work with the troubled stallion. It was the first of many such letters he would write over the coming years, as word of his methods spread throughout the West and requests for his services multiplied. But for now, as he sealed the letter and handed it to the ranch hand who would carry it to town, Thomas was content to simply hold his wife's hand and watch the snow fall on the land that had given them both everything they had ever wanted: love, purpose, and the promise of a future built on trust and understanding. In the pasture beyond, Blackwood raised her head and looked toward the cabin where the patient cowboy and his bride were beginning their new life together. The Mare's dark eyes seemed to hold approval, as if she understood that some bonds, once forged through patience and respect, could weather any storm and last forever. The Colorado mountains rose like jagged teeth against the pale March sky as Thomas and Evangeline's train pulled into the depot at Cedar Falls. After 3 days of travel through increasingly rugged terrain, they had finally reached their destination, the sprawling Rock Ridge Ranch owned by cattle magnate Harrison Blackwell, whose prize stallion had become the talk of the territory for all the wrong reasons. Evangeline pressed her face to the window as the train wheezed to a stop, taking in her first sight of the high country. The landscape was dramatically different from the rolling plains of Texas, with snow-capped peaks stretching endlessly in every direction and valleys carved deep by ancient glaciers. Pine forests blanketed the mountainsides, and the air that rushed through the open car door carried the crisp bite of altitude and the promise of winter's final storms. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "I never imagined anything could be so vast." Thomas helped her down from the train car, both of them grateful to stretch their legs after the long journey. Their simple travel clothes and worn leather luggage marked them as different from the usual visitors to this wealthy ranching community, where Eastern money had built mansions that wouldn't have looked out of place in Denver or San Francisco. A tall, distinguished man in an expensive coat approached them across the platform. His silver hair was perfectly groomed despite the mountain wind, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to command. This could only be Harrison Blackwell himself, and the fact that he had come personally to meet them spoke to the severity of his problem. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitman, I presume? I'm Harrison Blackwell. Welcome to Colorado." His handshake was firm, but Thomas detected the tension beneath his polite greeting. "I trust your journey wasn't too arduous?" "Not at all, Mr. Blackwell," Thomas replied. "We're grateful for the opportunity to help with your stallion." Blackwell's expression darkened slightly. "Help is exactly what we need. I'll be frank with you. Midnight has become dangerous. 3 of my best trainers have been injured trying to work with him, and my ranch foreman is pushing me to put the animal down before someone gets killed." As they rode in Blackwell's carriage toward the ranch, the full scope of the problem became clear. Midnight had been Blackwell's pride and joy, a magnificent black thoroughbred stallion imported from Kentucky at enormous expense. The horse had been gentle and responsive until a pack of wolves had attacked the herd he was running with 6 months earlier. Though Midnight had survived the encounter with only minor injuries, the psychological trauma had transformed him into a creature of pure fury and terror. "He won't let anyone approach his stall," Blackwell explained as they wound through mountain valleys dotted with grazing cattle. "We have to throw hay over the fence and slide water buckets under the rails. The few times we've managed to get him into the corral, he's tried to kill anyone who comes near him." Evangeline listened to this account with growing concern. The case sounded far more severe than Blackwood's initial wildness, which had been more about independence than genuine trauma. "Has anyone tried working with him using gentler methods?" Blackwell looked surprised that she had spoken. In his experience, wives accompanied their husbands on business trips to provide social companionship, not to offer professional opinions. "Gentler methods? Ma'am, with respect, this animal is beyond gentle. He's a killer." "Sometimes the most violent reactions come from the deepest fear," Thomas said quietly. "A horse that's been truly traumatized doesn't trust anyone or anything. He's not being vicious, he's trying to survive." The Rockridge Ranch was even more impressive than its reputation suggested. The main house was a 3-story Victorian mansion that wouldn't have looked out of place in the finest neighborhoods of Chicago, while the barns and outbuildings were constructed with a level of craftsmanship that spoke to unlimited resources. Everything was painted, maintained, and organized with military precision, but it was the silence around the stallion barn that truly caught Thomas's attention. On a ranch this size, there should have been constant activity, hands-moving horses, the sounds of training and daily care. Instead, an eerie quiet hung over the area like a shroud. "That's where we keep him," Blackwell said, pointing to a large barn set apart from the others. "No one goes near that building unless absolutely necessary." Thomas asked to see Midnight immediately, despite Blackwell's suggestion that they rest first after their journey. As they approached the isolated barn, the sounds began, a rhythmic pounding that shook the building's frame, punctuated by the shrill screams of an animal in distress. "He does that for hours," Blackwell said grimly, "especially when he hears people approaching. We've had to reinforce the stall twice already." The interior of the barn was darker than usual, with most of the windows boarded up to prevent the stallion from injuring himself. But even in the dim light, Thomas could see the destruction midnight had wreaked on his prison. The wooden walls of his stall were splintered and gouged, and the floor was torn up where his hooves had struck again and again in mindless rage. When Midnight caught sight of the visitors, his fury intensified. He was indeed magnificent, 17 hands of pure muscle and bone, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb light. But his eyes burned with a madness that made even Thomas take an involuntary step backward. This wasn't the calculated defiance he had seen in Blackwood, but raw, primal terror translated into violent aggression. "Dear God," Evangeline whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for Thomas's arm. "What have they done to you?" Midnight reared and struck at the reinforced rails of his stall, the impact sending vibrations through the floor. Foam flecked his muzzle, and his breathing came in harsh, ragged gasps. Every line of his body screamed of an animal pushed beyond the breaking point. "How long has he been confined like this?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Since the wolf attack," Blackwell replied. "We tried turning him out in the pastures, but he attacked other horses. He nearly killed my prize Mare before we managed to separate them." Thomas studied the stallion's condition with growing concern. Midnight was clearly suffering from more than psychological trauma. His physical health was deteriorating from lack of proper exercise and the constant stress of confinement. His ribs were beginning to show, and his coat had lost the glossy sheen of a healthy horse. "This has to stop," Thomas said firmly. "If we continue to treat him like a dangerous criminal, he'll only get worse." "What are you proposing?" Blackwell demanded. "That we let him loose to terrorize the entire ranch? I'm proposing that we start treating him like a horse that's been through hell instead of a monster that needs to be caged." Thomas turned away from the stall, unable to watch Midnight's suffering any longer. "But it's going to require patience and a complete change in approach." That evening, over dinner in the Blackwells' opulent dining room, Thomas outlined his plan. The first step would be moving Midnight to a larger paddock, where he could move freely without being able to harm other animals or people. Then would come the slow process of rebuilding trust, starting with simply being present without making demands. "You want to sit in a paddock with that devil horse?" Mrs. Blackwell asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. She was a stern woman who seemed to view the world through a lens of rigid propriety and barely concealed disapproval of anything that disrupted her ordered existence. "Not immediately," Thomas replied patiently. "First, we let him decompress from months of confinement. Let him remember what it feels like to move freely without constant fear." "And how long is this process supposed to take?" Blackwell asked. "I have a ranch to run, and I can't afford to keep feeding an animal that serves no purpose." "With respect, sir, you've been feeding him for 6 months already without any progress. My way might take longer, but it actually has a chance of succeeding." The next morning, Thomas began implementing his plan despite the obvious skepticism of the ranch hands. Moving Midnight from his stall to the larger paddock required elaborate precautions, including temporary barriers and escape routes for the men involved. The stallion fought every step of the process, but once he found himself in the open space, a remarkable transformation began. For the first time in months, Midnight could stretch his legs and move naturally. He galloped the perimeter of the paddock repeatedly, working off energy and frustration that had been building during his confinement. Gradually, his frantic pacing slowed to a more normal gait, though he remained hypervigilant and aggressive toward any human presence. Thomas set up a simple camp outside the paddock fence, positioning himself where Midnight could see him, but at a distance that didn't trigger immediate attacks. Evangeline joined him there, bringing meals and companionship while he began the patient work of simply existing in the stallion's world without making demands. "The hands think you're crazy," she told him on the third day, settling beside him on a blanket spread on the cold ground. "They're betting on how long it takes before you give up and recommend putting him down. And what do you think?" Thomas asked, his eyes never leaving the pacing stallion. I think you're the only person who's looked at that horse and seen past his fear to the pain underneath. Evangeline watched Midnight complete another circuit of the paddock, noting how his movement was gradually becoming less frantic. He reminds me of someone else I know who was determined not to trust anyone. Thomas glanced at her with surprise. Who? Me, she said simply. Before you came along, I had convinced myself that every man who showed interest was only after my father's money or my appearance. I built walls just as high as Midnight's, and I was just as determined to keep everyone at a safe distance. You never attacked anyone with hooves and teeth, Thomas pointed out with a slight smile. No, but I perfected the art of verbal rejection. Some of those suitors probably felt like they'd been kicked. Evangeline leaned against his shoulder, finding comfort in his solid presence. What made you keep trying with me? Thomas considered the question seriously. I suppose I recognized something in your eyes that reminded me of horses I'd worked with before. A kind of intelligence and spirit that had been hurt but not broken. I knew that if I could find a way past your defenses, there would be something extraordinary waiting. And you see that same thing in Midnight? I hope so. But his trauma runs deeper than anything I've encountered before. Those wolves didn't just attack his body. They shattered his ability to trust the world around him. As if to emphasize Thomas's point, Midnight suddenly wheeled and charged toward the fence where they sat, stopping just short of the rails and rearing with his front hooves, striking the air inches from their faces. Both Thomas and Evangeline held perfectly still, refusing to show fear despite the display of raw power and aggression. Easy, boy, Thomas said softly. We're not here to hurt you. Midnight's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice, and for just a moment, the madness in his eyes seemed to clear. Then the moment passed, and he spun away to resume his restless pacing. Did you see that? Evangeline asked excitedly. He heard you. Really heard you. Thomas nodded, feeling a flutter of hope in his chest. He's still in there somewhere. We just have to find a way to reach him. The breakthrough came a week later, during a spring snowstorm that forced everyone to seek shelter. Thomas had been maintaining his vigil despite the harsh weather, huddled under a canvas lean-to that provided minimal protection from the wind and driving snow. Midnight had taken refuge in the three-sided shelter at the far end of the paddock, but he emerged periodically to pace and check on his surroundings. During one of these circuits, the stallion slipped on a patch of ice and fell heavily, thrashing as he struggled to regain his footing. For a moment, he was vulnerable and helpless, and Thomas saw something shift in his expression, a flash of the terrified animal beneath the aggressive exterior. Without thinking, Thomas stood and approached the fence, his movements slow and deliberate despite the urgency he felt. Easy, Midnight, he called softly. You're all right. Just take your time. The stallion managed to get back on his feet, but instead of charging at Thomas, as he had done countless times before, he stood, shaking in the falling snow. His eyes, which had burned with constant fury for so long, now held a different emotion, exhaustion, and a desperate plea for understanding. Thomas climbed over the fence. It was an incredibly dangerous decision, one that could have cost him his life, but something in Midnight's posture told him that this was the moment when walls could finally come down. He moved slowly across the snowy ground, speaking in the same gentle tones he had used with Blackwood months earlier. Midnight tensed as Thomas approached, his muscles coiling for fight or flight. But when Thomas stopped just out of reach and simply stood there, offering no threat and making no demands, the stallion's aggressive posture gradually softened. I know you're scared, Thomas said quietly. I know you've been hurt and you don't know who to trust anymore. But you don't have to carry all that fear alone. The snow continued to fall around them, creating a curtain of white that isolated them from the rest of the world. In that moment, it was just a man and a traumatized horse, two beings trying to find a way to bridge the gap between pain and healing. Midnight took a tentative step forward, then stopped. His nostrils flared as he tested Thomas's scent, searching for any sign of deception or threat. Finding none, he took another step, then another, until he stood close enough for Thomas to feel his warm breath in the cold air. Very slowly, moving with infinite care, Thomas raised his hand toward the stallion's muzzle. Midnight's entire body trembled with the effort of restraining his flight instincts, but he held his ground as Thomas's fingers made gentle contact with his nose. It was the first peaceful touch the stallion had experienced since the night the wolves had shattered his world, and the effect was profound. The rigid tension in his muscles began to dissolve, and for the first time in months, his eyes held something other than fear and rage. From outside the paddock, Evangeline watched this miraculous moment with tears streaming down her face. She understood that she was witnessing more than just the taming of a difficult horse. She was seeing the power of patience and compassion to heal even the deepest wounds. The transformation wouldn't be complete overnight, but Thomas knew they had crossed a crucial threshold. Midnight was remembering how to trust, and with that trust would come the possibility of healing and eventually a return to the magnificent animal he had been before tragedy struck. As the snow continued to fall and the two figures stood together in the growing dusk, Evangeline reflected on the journey that had brought them to this remote mountain ranch. What had begun as a challenge to break a wild Mare had evolved into something far greater, a way of life built on understanding, patience, and the belief that even the most damaged spirits could find their way back to wholeness. The spring thaw had transformed the Colorado landscape by the time Thomas made his next breakthrough with Midnight. What had begun as tentative moments of trust during the snowstorm had gradually developed into something more substantial, a working relationship built on mutual respect rather than dominance and submission. The stallion still carried the scars of his trauma, but they no longer defined every moment of his existence. Harrison Blackwell stood at the fence of the training paddock, watching in amazement as Thomas guided Midnight through a series of complex maneuvers with nothing more than gentle pressure from his legs and subtle movements of his hands. The transformation was so complete that visiting ranchers refused to believe this was the same animal that had terrorized the ranch just 2 months earlier. "I owe you an apology, Whitman," Blackwell said, his voice carrying a humility that was rare for a man of his wealth and standing. "When you first arrived, I thought your methods were too soft for a horse that was dangerous. I was wrong." Thomas brought Midnight to a halt near the fence, the stallion's breathing easy and relaxed. "Despite the workout, no apology necessary, sir. What happened to him would have broken most horses completely. The fact that he came back from it at all speaks to his fundamental character." Evangeline approached from the direction of the main house, carrying a leather portfolio that had arrived with the morning mail. Over the past 2 months, she had become an integral part of their operation, handling correspondence with potential clients and managing the practical details that allowed Thomas to focus on his work with the horses. "More letters," she announced, holding up the portfolio. 3 from California, 2 from Montana, and 1 from a place called Silver Creek, Nevada. Word is definitely spreading. The success with Midnight had exceeded everyone's expectations, including Thomas's own. Not only had the stallion recovered his former gentle nature, but he had developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to his rider's intentions. Blackwell claimed that Midnight could now anticipate his wishes before he was fully conscious of them himself, making the pair nearly unbeatable in local racing competitions. "What do you think, Mrs. Whitman?" Blackwell asked. "Are you and your husband ready to take on the entire American West?" Evangeline glanced at Thomas, recognizing the mixture of excitement and uncertainty in his expression. The flood of requests for their services represented opportunities beyond anything they had imagined when they left Texas, but it also meant crucial decisions about the direction of their future. "We'll need to discuss it," she replied diplomatically. Success brings its own challenges. That evening, in their rooms at the local boarding house, Thomas and Evangeline spread the letters across their small table and tried to make sense of the opportunities before them. The requests ranged from individual problem horses to entire herds that needed retraining after traumatic experiences with rustlers or predators. The California offer is the most lucrative, Evangeline noted, reviewing the correspondence from a wealthy vineyard owner whose imported Arabian horses had been spooked by a wildfire. He's offering twice what Blackwell paid us, plus travel, expenses, and accommodations. But the Nevada case sounds more interesting, Thomas replied, studying a letter written in a woman's careful handwriting. A widow trying to save her late husband's horse breeding operation after the animals were scattered by a flash flood. She doesn't have much money, but you can't resist helping someone who really needs it, Evangeline finished with a close, knowing smile. It's one of the things I love about you, even when it drives me to distraction from a business perspective. Thomas looked up from the letters, suddenly serious. Evangeline, are you happy with this life we're building? All this travel, living in boarding houses and hotels, never knowing where we'll be from month to month. She considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined choosing such an uncertain existence over the comfortable predictability of ranch life in Texas, but watching Thomas work with traumatized horses had taught her something about herself, that she thrived on challenges and new experiences in ways she had never understood while confined to her father's ranch. I love seeing you do what you were born to do, she said finally. And I love being part of something that makes a real difference in people's lives. As for the uncertainty, ... She shrugged. I've learned that security isn't about staying in one place. It's about being with someone you can trust completely, no matter where life takes you. Thomas reached across the table to take her hand. Even if it takes us to Nevada to help a widow we've never met? Especially then, Evangeline replied firmly. Besides, I've been thinking about something. All these requests we're receiving, they're not just about individual horses. They represent a fundamental change in how people think about training animals. What you're doing is revolutionary, Thomas. It deserves to be preserved and taught. What do you mean? Evangeline pulled out a leather-bound journal she had been keeping during their travels. I've been documenting your methods, writing down the techniques and principles you use with different types of horses. I think we should consider writing a book. Thomas stared at her in amazement. A book? Evangeline, I'm just a cowboy who happens to be good with horses. Who would want to read anything I have to say? Every rancher, horse breeder, and trainer in the country, for starters. What you've accomplished with Blackwood and Midnight isn't just impressive, it's proof that there's a better way to work with these animals. A way that produces better results with less risk to both horse and human. The idea was intriguing, but also intimidating. Thomas had never considered himself qualified to instruct others in anything beyond basic horsemanship. Yet, as he thought about the letters spread across their table, each representing people struggling with problems he had learned to solve, he began to see the wisdom in Evangeline's suggestion. It would mean staying in one place long enough to actually write it, he pointed out. That doesn't align well with all these requests for our services. Not necessarily. What if we established a permanent base of operations? Somewhere we could bring difficult cases for intensive work, while also having the facilities to teach others your methods. Thomas felt a spark of excitement at the possibility. You mean our own ranch? Exactly. We could take on the most challenging cases, document everything for the book, and gradually train other horsemen in your techniques. It would multiply our impact far beyond what we could achieve traveling from ranch to ranch. The conversation continued late into the night as they explored the possibilities and challenges of such an ambitious undertaking. By morning, they had made their decision. They would complete their current commitments, including the Nevada case, while looking for the right property to establish their own training facility. The journey to Silver Creek, Nevada, took them through some of the most spectacular and desolate country either had ever seen. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with alkali flats stretching to distant mountains that seemed to shimmer in the desert heat. It was a land that demanded respect and punished the unprepared, yet there was a stark beauty in its very hostility. Rebecca Morrison met them at the train station in Silver Creek, a town that consisted of little more than a few weathered buildings clustered around a single main street. She was a woman in her early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and hands that spoke of years of hard work. Her husband had died in the flash flood that destroyed their ranch 6 months earlier, leaving her with debts, scattered horses, and a determination to honor his memory by rebuilding what they had created together. "I won't lie to you," she said as they rode in her buckboard toward the remains of her ranch. "I can't pay you what you're worth. Most of my money goes to feed and basic repairs. But these horses, they were my husband's life work. If they can't be saved, I'll have to sell them for whatever I can get, probably to men who won't understand their value." The Morrison ranch had indeed been devastated by the flood. What remained of the main house was a water-stained shell, while the barns had been completely destroyed. The horses themselves were scattered across a temporary paddock system that Rebecca had constructed with salvaged materials and sheer determination. Thomas counted 37 horses in various states of psychological distress. Some huddled together in nervous groups, starting at every sound. Others paced endlessly, unable to settle. A few stood apart from the rest, their eyes holding the hollow look of animals that had given up hope entirely. "They were trapped in the barn when the water hit," Rebecca explained, her voice tight with remembered anguish. "My husband died trying to get them out. By the time the flood receded, half of them were injured and all of them were traumatized. The vet said most of them would never be right again." Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes as she imagined the terror those animals had experienced. "How many did you lose?" 14 horses and my husband," Rebecca replied simply. "The survivors have been like this ever since. Some won't let humans approach at all. Others seem to have lost their minds entirely." Thomas studied the herd with growing understanding. This wasn't a case of individual trauma like Midnight had suffered, but collective psychological damage that had affected an entire community of animals. The techniques he had developed for working with single horses would need to be adapted for a much more complex situation. "How much time do we have?" he asked. "The bank is giving me until the end of summer to prove the ranch is viable." "Again," Rebecca said, "if I can't demonstrate that the horses are worth something, they'll foreclose and sell everything to pay my debts." 3 months to rehabilitate nearly 40 traumatized horses while building a case for the ranch's financial viability. It was an almost impossible challenge, but as Thomas looked at Rebecca's determined expression and thought about her husband's sacrifice, he knew they had to try. "We'll need to start by separating them into groups based on the severity of their trauma," he told Rebecca. "The ones that are just nervous can probably be helped relatively quickly. The others will take longer, but I believe they can all be saved." Over the following weeks, Thomas and Evangeline threw themselves into the most challenging work of their careers. They established a system of rotating paddocks that allowed them to work with small groups of horses, while keeping the more traumatized animals isolated from negative influences. The techniques that had worked with individual horses like Blackwood and Midnight had to be modified and expanded to address the complex social dynamics of a damaged herd. Evangeline proved invaluable in this process, her natural empathy and patience complementing Thomas's technical expertise. She developed a particular talent for working with the Mares who had lost foals in the flood, spending hours simply sitting with them and allowing them to process their grief at their own pace. The breakthrough came when they realized that some of the less damaged horses could be used to help rehabilitate their more traumatized companions. By carefully pairing recovered animals with those still struggling, They created a support system within the herd that accelerated the healing process dramatically. It's like they're teaching each other to trust again, Evangeline observed, as they watched a formerly terrified gelding take comfort from the presence of a Mare who had already regained her confidence. Horses are herd animals, Thomas replied. In nature, they would have worked through trauma like this together. We just gave them permission to do what comes naturally. As summer progressed, the transformation at the Morrison Ranch became evident to everyone in the region. Visitors came from miles around to witness horses that had been written off as hopeless, performing with grace and responsiveness under Rebecca's guidance. The woman who had nearly lost everything was gradually rebuilding not just her herd, but her entire operation. The financial turning point came when a delegation of ranchers from California arrived to purchase breeding stock. They had heard rumors about the miracle horses of Silver Creek and wanted to see for themselves if the stories were true. What they found exceeded their expectations, and they left with a dozen animals and orders for more. I can pay off the bank and still have enough left to rebuild properly, Rebecca told Thomas and Evangeline as they prepared to depart in late August. I can never thank you enough for what you've done. You don't need to thank us, Thomas replied. Seeing those horses recover their spirit has been reward enough. As their train pulled away from Silver Creek, carrying them toward their next adventure, Evangeline reflected on how much they had learned during their time in Nevada. The techniques they had developed for working with traumatized herds would prove invaluable in their future work, but more importantly, they had demonstrated that their methods could be adapted to almost any situation. I've been thinking about our book, she told Thomas as the desert landscape rolled past their window. What we accomplished here proves that your methods aren't just effective with individual horses. They represent a complete philosophy of animal training that could revolutionize the entire industry. Thomas nodded, his mind already working through the implications of what they had learned. We'll need to find that permanent base soon. There's too much to document and too many people who need to learn these techniques for us to keep traveling from crisis to crisis. I may have an idea about that, Evangeline said, pulling out a letter that had arrived just before their departure. My father writes that Blackwood's foal was born last month. A filly black as her mother, but with her father's gentle temperament. He thinks she might be the foundation for something special. Thomas smiled, remembering the wild Mare who had started their entire journey. Maybe it's time to go home and see what the next generation has to teach us. Outside their window, the Nevada desert gave way to greener country as they traveled east toward Texas and the ranch where their story had begun. Behind them, they left a legacy of healed horses and restored hope. Ahead lay the promise of building something permanent and lasting, a place where their methods could be refined, taught, and passed on to future generations of horsemen who understood that the greatest victories came not from conquest, but from the patient work of earning trust. 5 years had passed since Thomas Whitman first walked into Jeremiah McAllister's corral to face a wild Mare named Blackwood. Now as he stood on the porch of the ranch house that had become the headquarters of the Whitman Horse Training Institute, he could barely recognize the humble beginning that had led to this moment. The McAllister Ranch had been transformed into something unprecedented in the American West, where once there had been simple corrals and basic facilities. Now stood a complex of specialized training areas, comfortable housing for visiting students, and a modern barn designed specifically for working with traumatized horses. The changes went far beyond the physical structures. The ranch had become a destination for horsemen from across the continent, who came to learn what newspapers had dubbed the Whitman Method. Thomas watched as his latest group of students worked with their assigned horses in the morning sunlight. Among them were seasoned ranch foremen, cavalry officers, wealthy Eastern equestrians, and even a few women who had defied social convention to pursue their passion for horses. Each brought their own experiences and challenges, but all were united in their desire to learn a better way. The Colorado group arrives this afternoon, Evangeline announced, joining him on the porch with their 18-month-old son balanced on her hip. Little James had his father's calm brown eyes and his mother's auburn hair, and he already showed signs of the same intuitive understanding of horses that had made Thomas famous. "And the book shipment?" Thomas asked, still marveling at the success of The Patient Approach, Revolutionary Methods for Horse Training, that had been published the previous year. Sold out again in Denver and San Francisco. The publisher wants to discuss a second printing run. Evangeline shifted James to her other arm, smiling at her husband's obvious discomfort with his newfound fame. "You're going to have to accept that you're no longer just a traveling cowboy, Thomas Whitman. You're changing how people think about animals." The success had indeed been overwhelming. What had started as Evangeline's simple documentation of Thomas's methods had evolved into a comprehensive guide that covered everything from basic horse psychology to advanced rehabilitation techniques for traumatized animals. The book had found audiences far beyond the ranching community, with veterinarians, circus trainers, and even some physicians expressing interest in applying similar principles to their work with humans. "Papa! Papa!" The excited voice belonged to their 4-year-old daughter Sarah, who came running across the yard with something clutched in her small hands. She had been named for Thomas's mother and possessed an uncanny ability to communicate with horses that amazed even experienced horsemen. "What do you have there, little one?" Thomas asked, kneeling down to her level. "Star had her baby," Sarah announced breathlessly, referring to Blackwood's daughter who had matured into a magnificent Mare. "Grandpa Mac says it's the prettiest foal he's ever seen." Thomas and Evangeline exchanged glances. Star's pregnancy had been highly anticipated, as she represented the next generation of horses bred specifically for intelligence and temperament rather than just size and speed. If the foal inherited the best qualities of both parents, it could mark another breakthrough in their ongoing work. They found Jeremiah McAllister in the foaling barn, his weathered face glowing with pride as he watched Star nuzzle her newborn colt. The foal was indeed remarkable, coal-black like his grandmother Blackwood, but with distinctive white markings and an alert, fearless demeanor that suggested exceptional intelligence. "Look at that," McAllister said softly. 3 generations, and each one better than the last. Your method isn't just about training horses, Thomas. You're proving that kindness and patience can actually improve the breed itself. Thomas studied the colt with growing excitement. The animal showed none of the skittishness common in newborns, instead displaying a calm curiosity about his surroundings. When Thomas approached the stall, the foal stepped forward rather than retreating, already demonstrating the trust that had taken months to build with his wild grandmother. "He's going to be special," Evangeline observed, noting how Star remained relaxed despite human presence near her offspring. "What will you call him?" Thomas considered the question seriously. Names had meaning in their operation, often reflecting the journey that had brought each horse to them. "Promise," he said finally. "He represents the promise of what's possible when we choose understanding over domination." The afternoon brought the arrival of the Colorado delegation, a group of wealthy ranch owners who had traveled specifically to see the Whitman Institute in operation. Among them was Harrison Blackwell, now one of Thomas's most vocal supporters and financial backers. The transformation of Midnight had not only saved Blackwell's prize stallion, but had also made him a fortune as the horse's offspring commanded premium prices throughout the territory. "Gentlemen," Thomas addressed the group as they gathered in the main training arena, "what you're about to see challenges everything most of us were taught about working with horses. I ask only that you observe with open minds and remember that every technique we demonstrate was developed through patience, not force." The demonstration featured 6 horses, each representing a different type of challenge that students might encounter. There was a formerly wild Mustang similar to Blackwood, a cavalry horse traumatized by battle, a racing thoroughbred made vicious by harsh treatment, a draft horse too large for most men to control through strength alone, a Mare that had rejected human contact after losing a foal, and a young stallion displaying aggressive territorial behavior. What followed was 2 hours of practical education that left the visitors speechless. Each horse was approached differently, but the underlying principles remained constant: respect for the animal's intelligence, patience with their fears, and the gradual building of trust through consistent, gentle handling. "The key," Thomas explained as he worked with the traumatized cavalry horse, "is to understand that every behavior has a reason. This gelding isn't being difficult out of malice. He's protecting himself from experiences that taught him humans meant pain and terror. Our job isn't to break his spirit, but to show him that not all humans are the same." By the end of the demonstration, each horse was responding calmly to commands and showing clear signs of trust toward their handlers. The transformation was so complete that several visitors asked to verify that these were indeed the same animals they had seen exhibiting problematic behaviors at the beginning. "This changes everything," one of the Colorado ranchers admitted. "If these methods can produce results like this consistently, every trainer in the country needs to learn them." As evening fell and the visitors departed with promises to send their own problem horses to the Institute, Thomas found himself alone with his family in their expanded cabin. The children were asleep, and Evangeline was reviewing correspondence from potential students and clients that seemed to grow larger every week. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is real," Thomas said, settling into his favorite chair by the fireplace. "5 years ago, I was just a drifter looking for work. Now we have people calling me a revolutionary." "You were always a revolutionary," Evangeline replied, looking up from her papers. "You just needed the right stage to prove it. The question now is what comes next." It was a question that had been weighing on Thomas's mind increasingly. The Institute was successful beyond their wildest dreams. The book had established his reputation internationally, and their methods were being adopted by trainers across the continent. Yet he felt there was still more to accomplish. "I've been thinking about the military applications," he said. "The cavalry officers who've trained here have reported remarkable improvements in horse-soldier relationships. If we could convince the Army to adopt our methods officially, you'd save countless horses and riders from unnecessary injury," Evangeline finished. "It's worth pursuing." "What else?" "International expansion. We've had inquiries from England, France, even Australia. There are horsemen everywhere who could benefit from what we've learned." Evangeline smiled at her husband's ambition. The quiet cowboy who had once been content to drift from ranch to ranch had developed into a visionary whose ideas could influence horse training worldwide. "And personally, what do you want for our family?" Thomas looked around their comfortable home, thinking of their children growing up surrounded by horses and the values that had shaped their success. "I want them to understand that the greatest victories in life come from patience, kindness, and the courage to try something different when the old ways aren't working. Whether they choose to continue our work or pursue their own dreams, those principles will serve them well." A soft whicker from outside drew their attention to the window. In the moonlight, they could see Blackwood grazing peacefully in the pasture with her daughter and grandson. The wild Mare who had once terrorized cowboys was now the gentle matriarch of a dynasty that embodied everything Thomas and Evangeline had worked to achieve. "She's the real hero of this story," Thomas observed. "If she hadn't been willing to trust one patient cowboy, none of this would have happened." "No," Evangeline corrected gently, taking his hand. "You're both heroes. She taught you that even the wildest hearts can be won through patience and respect. You taught the world that there's always a better way if you're brave enough to try it." As they prepared for bed, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a simple challenge to break a wild Mare had evolved into a life's work that was changing how humans related to animals. More importantly, it had given him a partnership with a woman who shared his vision and supported his dreams. Even when they seemed impossible, the next morning would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to spread their message of patience and understanding. But tonight, Thomas Whitman was content to hold his wife's hand and listen to the gentle sounds of horses moving peacefully in the darkness outside their window. The patient cowboy had indeed won both the Mare and the maiden, but in doing so, he had discovered something far more valuable than either prize alone could offer, a purpose that would outlast his own lifetime and a legacy built on the simple truth that kindness, given time, could overcome any obstacle. In the distance, Promise nickered softly to his mother, a sound that carried the echo of his grandmother's wild spirit, tempered by generations of trust. It was the sound of the future, and it was beautiful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.